This video was brought to you by the TLDR Discord. Get involved in the conversation by clicking the link below. You might have seen in the news recently that Biden's been ordering airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. So we wanted to break down exactly what's been happening and why the president has been intervening in recent days. So let's start with a quick disclaimer. As with all things Middle East, this is complicated. A complete description of events would require a book, so apologies in advance if we omit something you think is important. Leave a comment below to let us know, and we might rectify it in a future video. Alright, so let's just get straight to it. On Monday, Joe Biden ordered airstrikes against military facilities apparently used by Kataib Hezbollah and Kataib Saeed al-Shushada on the Iraq-Syria border, killing 4 militants. According to the US, Kataib Hezbollah and Kataib Saeed al-Shushada are responsible for a recent spate of drone attacks against Iraqi-US coalition forces in Iraq, and are both financially backed by Iran. This is the second time this has happened, because back in February, Biden ordered airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias after a rocket attack in the Iraqi city of Erbil killed a Filipino civilian contractor and injured 6 others, including 1 US soldier. So why is the US bombing Iranian-backed militias? Well, to understand this, we probably have to go back a bit. At least since the Tehran hostage crisis in the early 80s, and perhaps even as far back as the 1953 US-UK intervention, US-Iran relationships have been tense. Over the last 20 years, and especially since the Arab uprising, Iran has been supported by various proxy militias across the Middle East, including Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon, who are often in conflict with US-backed military coalitions in the Middle East. This is essentially because Iran can't risk direct conflict with the US, so it relies on proxy groups as a form of asymmetric warfare. Proxy groups allow Iran to attack, or at least fund attacks on the US, but not for the US to attack Iran, because Iran can just turn around and say, hey, that wasn't us, that was proxy militia X. Or at least that used to be the case, until Trump. For a number of reasons, but at least in part because Trump didn't much care for geopolitical norms, Trump ended this stalemate in January 2020 by assassinating Qasem Soleimani, commander and de facto right-hand man of Iran's supreme leader, via a drone strike near Baghdad. The assassination followed attacks by Iranian-backed militias on the US embassy in Baghdad and a K-1 military base where 1 US contractor was killed. These attacks were actually carried out by Kataib Hezbollah, an Iraqi Shia militia who are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF. Keep those names in mind, by the way, because they'll be relevant again in a second. Now, historically, the US wouldn't respond to proxy attacks by directly attacking Iranian assets. Instead, they'd attack proxies. For example, a month before, after the K-1 base attack, the US retaliated by attacking Kataib Hezbollah weapon deposits, instead of attacking Iranian assets. Anyway, Trump apparently decided to change all of that, and attack Iranian assets directly. It's worth noting that the airstrike that killed Soleimani also killed 4 members of the PMF, including leader of the PMF and Kataib Hezbollah, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. So, what was the Iranian response to this escalation? Well, a few days later, Iran launched a series of missile strikes at 2 US military bases. No Americans were killed or injured in the strikes, at least in part because Iran had informed the Iraqi government beforehand, who in turn informed the US, allowing them time to prepare. It's worth noting that in the hours before the attack, Iranian forces mistakenly shot down a Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752, killing 176 people. Anyway, some analysts speculated that Iran notified Iraq because they didn't actually want to kill any US personnel, for fear of triggering a direct conflict. Whatever the truth is, the point is that Iran's retaliation was suspiciously small, given that the US had just killed their top military commander. And that's probably because it wasn't the only way that Iran decided to retaliate. After Soleimani's assassination, Iranian-backed militias increased the frequency of attacks on US forces, especially in Iraq. Which leads us to now. In February of this year, the PMF launched 3 airstrikes against US targets in just 1 week. In response, Biden launched airstrikes against the PMF's base in Abu Kamal, his first military action as president. This apparently failed to deter the PMF, who have launched at least 5 more missile strikes since, the latest coming on Monday evening. In response, the US launched strikes on their rocket launching positions, killing 4 combatants, which is what all the headlines on Monday were about. So what does the US hope to achieve from these strikes? Well, according to the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, these strikes are about de-escalation, essentially limiting conflict by deterring Iranian-backed militias from any more missile strikes. De-escalation requires a delicate balancing act though. Too small and the strikes won't deter anyone. Too big and they'll force an even angrier retaliation. Unfortunately, de-escalation also looks less and less likely post-Trump. This would require another video entirely, so we're not going to go into it in too much detail, but there are essentially 2 reasons why de-escalation looks less likely. First, the election of Iran's new president, conservative hardliner Ebrahim Raisi. Raisi's hardline tendencies make him unlikely to agree to any sort of slowdown in Iranian funding of proxy militias. But the second issue is due to the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal. In May 2018, Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed economic sanctions on the country. Unsurprisingly, Iran subsequently increased production of enriched uranium and now have enough to make a bomb. The diplomatic stress incurred by the US sanctions and Iran's nuclear production have made any de-escalation far more politically difficult. As a last thing, let's talk about how this affects the Iran nuclear deal. Biden has made clear that he wants to re-enter the deal, but Republicans, some Democrats, and Iran's regional rivals want him to use the renegotiations to force Iran to stop supporting proxy militias in the Middle East. However, the more heated the proxy warfare becomes, the harder it will be to include this in the renegotiations. This makes things even more politically difficult for Biden, and makes successful renegotiations less likely. As a final thing, it's worth noting that Iraq suffers the brunt of this proxy conflict. Most of the conflict is fought on Iraqi soil, which not only destroys infrastructure, but destabilizes and undermines the Iraqi authorities, whose patience is growing thin. In a rare criticism, the Iraqi Prime Minister called the latest set of US strikes a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. And this change of heart is presumably because he realises that de-escalation is looking increasingly unlikely, and doesn't want his country to become the backdrop to an ever-escalating Iran-US proxy war. Let us know what you think of this situation, Biden's decision, and the US's involvement in the region. You can do that both in the comments and over on the TLDR Discord server, where thousands of TLDR viewers discuss the latest news, videos, and, well, whatever they want. Join the fun by clicking the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.